When Mike German joined the FBI in his early 20s, it was kind of a dream come true.
I grew up in a military household where government service was expected, duty, honor, country, and wanted to be an FBI agent from the time I was a little boy.
He was eager to go out and start catching some bad guys. But as with most entry-level gigs, things didn't go exactly as planned, at work or in the world, because it was 1988.
The mood on Wall Street is one of shock and disbelief. For 5 years, the great bull market seemed unstoppable. Then came Black Monday.
Attorneys for the investors are not laughing. They have built a case against Keating as former owner of Lincoln Savings and Loan.
You're probably going to be seeing nervous breakdowns before long in this market.
So instead of chasing bad guys, Mike spent the first 4 years of his career working on $100 million bank failure investigations.
So, after 4 years of that, I was very eager for a change. And when a colleague kind of looked at me looking very young and blonde, said, hey, I'm working this undercover FBI operation, and I think you'd be perfect undercover agent. Would you do it? And it seemed like it would be very different from my previous investigation, and I was eager to try something new.
By this time, it was 1992, and Mike was in Los Angeles, where a jury had just acquitted 4 LA police officers involved in the beating of Rodney King. LA was in chaos, and Mike was sent undercover into a network of neo-Nazi accelerationists who hoped to stoke that chaos into a full-blown race war. And a big part of his job was to get them on tape.
I had cassette tapes, if you remember those.
Oh my gosh, that's huge.
Right. And they had 2 sides. So I would have to keep my eye on the clock and excuse myself to the restroom every 30 minutes or so to change the tapes. It was certainly a risk, and it was, not very sophisticated. I basically had what amounted to a Sony Walkman taped to my leg with a microphone wire up and taped with athletic tape to my chest.
The plan was for an informant to introduce Mike as a guy with a criminal past so that the group wouldn't mess with him. But that didn't guarantee he'd be safe.
It was like the high school lunchroom, right? There was the cool kid table and there was the nerd table, and, how do you move from the nerd table to the cool kid table? And then, of course, if you do that, all the nerds hate you and try to, undermine your reputation. So it was kind of like that. And there was a person who didn't like me because I had become popular within this group and was saying things, basically the way to knock somebody down a peg is to accuse them of being an informant.
It was dangerous to be accused, and Mike needed a way to deflect attention.
So the case agent at one point said, okay, look, to kind of nip this in the bud, at the next meeting, I want you to not wear a wire. Go in, strip down, say, if anybody's concerned, let's all strip down and make sure none of us are informants, none of us are recording. And I said, no, that won't work. And he's like, no, I think that'll be good, that you kind of bond that way, that, okay, we're all willing to expose ourselves. And I said, no, it won't work. And he's like, well, I think we should try. What difference does it make? It's one meeting that's not recorded. And I said, no, it's that it won't work. And I took off my shirt, and I have fairly pale skin, and the tape irritated it. So I had a patchwork of tape rashes all over my upper body.
You're like, this is very obvious.
This is not going to be a pretty picture.
Today, Mike is an expert at the Brennan Center at Harvard University. And his work has more to do with investigating the FBI itself than wearing a wire. On this episode, we talk to Mike about what the FBI is getting right and getting wrong when it comes to domestic terrorism. And we talk about how all that might change under the Trump administration. I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
The 2024 election was a lot. And now that we're past it, you might be avoiding political news altogether. Or you might want to understand the other side of the aisle, but without poisoning your algorithm or treading into online territory that feels like an alien planet. You need Left, Right, and Center, It's your weekly political news check-in with representatives from both parties, so you can hear from the other guys in a way that helps you actually make sense of it. I'm David Green. Join me on Left, Right, and Center from KCRW. New episodes drop every Friday wherever you listen to podcasts.
Things That Go Boom is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. In 2015, Dylan Roof slaughtered 9 men and women in the middle of Sunday prayer in Charleston, South Carolina.
Friends tell us that Dylan Roof was a loner who was angry about racial matters. In recent weeks, he had talked openly about an attack on African Americans.
He had told me that the black people were taking over the country and that he wanted it to be segregation.
Investigators say he was carefully planning out to carry out his rampage and had even staked out Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church multiple times.
Based on an investigation of his belongings, Roof had fallen down a rabbit hole of white supremacist internet propaganda. An image from his Facebook page showed him wearing a jacket decorated with the flags of Rhodesia and apartheid-era South Africa.
Another photo shows Roof straddling the hood of his Hyundai and his decorative plate celebrating the Confederacy.
But when asked to comment, FBI Director James Comey said that he didn't see the violence as, quote, a political act.
Even if you believe that a mass murder at a black church in South Carolina wasn't in and of itself political, it's important to keep in mind that the reverend of that church was a sitting state legislator. So he was specifically targeted. A sitting state legislator was targeted. How is that not political?
Comey wasn't just making a judgment call here. By definition, Roof's actions would have to be deemed political for the FBI to label them an act of terrorism. What isn't so clear is what rises to meet the definition of political. Because just months after Roof's attack, Faisal Muhammad stabbed and injured 4 people at the University of California.
They say he had visited several terrorist websites before launching his attack at UC Merced.
In this case, it was ISIS propaganda on Muhammad's computer, and the FBI deemed it a lone wolf act of terror.
Senseless violence shattered Squirrel Hill, the heart of Pittsburgh's Jewish community, when a mass shooter took the lives of 11.
The person responsible for the murder of 11 people at a Pittsburgh synagogue, the guy who shouted, "All Jews must die," his indictment included no terrorism charge. The same is true for those responsible for the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville in 2017.
When a self-proclaimed admirer of Hitler rammed his car into a crowd.
This despite the fact that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions initially described the attack as meeting the definition of domestic terrorism. In the absence of terrorism charges, some experts argued that the Justice Department needed new terrorism-specific legal tools.
So there was a narrative after the Dylan Roof shooting in South Carolina that the reason the FBI and the Justice Department were not very effective in combating white supremacist violence was because they didn't have a domestic terrorism law. But that's completely false. I worked undercover as an FBI agent in the 1990s against violent white supremacists and far-right militant groups, and nobody in the 1990s suggested we didn't have sufficient law to address the problem.
Mike says it's simple. You just prosecute the crimes. And the current laws, they already address terrorism.
It was this strange argument that they were making that there wasn't a federal domestic terrorism law, when there is an entire chapter in the U.S. Criminal Code book called terrorism. And that chapter, like most statutes, starts out defining its terms. So it defines international terrorism simply by geography. If it occurred outside the United States, it's international terrorism. Domestic terrorism, again, by geography, if it occurred inside the United States, it's domestic terrorism. And then goes on to list 57 crimes that it calls federal crimes of terrorism. And 51 of those crimes apply to domestic terrorism, as defined in the statute. It's kind of this very strange semantic argument that was really designed not to give the government tools that it needed, but rather to give it tools to target groups that weren't engaged in the same kind of violence that white supremacists and far-right militants often engaged in.
The folks arguing for new laws say that domestic terrorists aren't punished as harshly as they should be, as harshly as, say, international terrorists. But others, like Mike, they worry that new domestic terrorism laws could be abused, even used to designate any group or movement that protested or even just disagreed with a president's policies as terrorists. And well, when you look at the history of the FBI, that's not so far-fetched. Let's take a quick jump back in time. See, the Justice Department was created by Ulysses S. Grant in the late 1800s. And anyone who feels like the FBI probably shouldn't be dipping its toes into racial violence might be surprised to hear that it was created specifically to counter white supremacy, namely the Ku Klux Klan and other violent groups that terrorized the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was literally called the U.S. Department of Justice and Civil Rights Enforcement, and it was actually pretty effective. By late 1871, the newly formed Justice Department had carried out more than 3,000 indictments and 600 more convictions. The Klan didn't reemerge for nearly half a century. It wasn't until a few decades later, in 1908, that the FBI was created as, essentially, an investigative arm of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. But you can never have too much of a good or bad thing, so eventually that little group of investigators, it got a name: the Bureau of Investigation. And it also got an ever-growing list of responsibilities, including rounding up political enemies under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Luckily, the church committee came around. First the burglars. The committee to investigate the FBI came around and burglarized an FBI building and proved that they were spying on student protesters, and ultimately exposed the COINTELPRO program that the FBI used to suppress First Amendment activity of an array of protest groups.
What Mike's referring to there is that in 1971, a group of anti-Vietnam War activists broke into an FBI office in Philadelphia. They recovered a trove of documents that launched a Senate inquiry led by Senator Frank Church. The Church Committee's findings led to revelations not just about Hoover, but also about years of spying on American citizens, including Martin Luther King Jr. and other political activists. It also led to reforms that placed constitutional checks on the FBI's operations.
And those were the rules that I operated on in my undercover cases. Rather than an obstacle, I found this regulation helpful because I'm undercover with violent neo-Nazis, right? All of them are saying things that scare me, that sound horrible, and make me believe that they could do harm to large numbers of people. But I would have to go back after a meeting and sit down with a piece of paper and document the evidence to justify me investigating each individual. And often what I found is that guy who's a loudmouth, he doesn't really do anything.
But here's where all of this history brings us to a big, glaring present-day problem. Because, according to Mike, the reason that we're not catching as many white supremacists as we should be isn't that we need a new law. It's that after 9/11, the FBI got a little too obsessed with those loudmouth guys. And not just where white supremacy was concerned.
We've seen the enemy in the murder of thousands of innocent, unsuspecting people. The terrorists cannot be reasoned with.
This is what happens with regressions in rights. They can sometimes take a long time, even a generation or two, to fix.
Just because we believe in procedural protections, just because we believe in the Constitution, doesn't mean that we don't want to capture terrorists, but we just want to have some rules.
Under the expanded authority of the Patriot Act, the reforms put in place after the Church Committee's revelations began to slip. And once again, the FBI started to worry less about the guys doing scary things and more about the guys saying scary things.
I think what gets missed is that the propagandist isn't necessarily a dangerous threat that law enforcement should be concerned with. And the way to suppress violent acts is to suppress the exchange of these dangerous, radical ideas. Now, keep in mind, this was the same theory that the government used to target Martin Luther King and others in the civil rights an anti-war movement during the 1960s and 70s, right? And it was discredited from that practice. But as a practical matter, undercover with these groups, what I found is many of the people who were most organized and ardent in the above ground propaganda part are not supportive of the violent wing.
Mike says that from what he's seen, it's often the opposite. He remembers this trial that he was part of after going undercover with a militia in the Pacific Northwest.
You know, the militias then and now kind of presented a more PR-friendly face than the neo-Nazis did. You know, a skinhead with a swastika on his forehead, Sieg Heiling, doesn't really attract a lot of positive support from communities. So these militia members had a lot of public support in the courtroom. And at the end of the trial, at the end of 6 weeks, one of the leaders, this elder in one of the groups who had been very outspoken and was always handing out literature in the courtroom and outside the court building, walked over to me and said, you know, I'd like to shake your hand. And he said, I sat through the whole trial, and it's very clear to me these people would have hurt somebody, and that would have really hurt my movement. So I appreciate what you did. This is a person in an anti-government militia thanking an FBI agent who went undercover to prevent people who he was affiliated with from doing harm.
He says that even on the inside, when the guys with the ideas, like the one that approached him after this trial, would see him hanging around with a more violent wing of the group, they'd try to step in.
They would kind of pull me aside and say, you know, those guys are going to get you killed or get you locked up. You know, that's not going to help our movement. You're a smart kid. We can put a suit on you and run you for the school board. That's how we're going to get our ideas across. So don't hang around with those idiots. That's not going to help our movement.
Whether you like that concept or not, Mike says if you're in law enforcement, those guys aren't your enemies. They're your allies.
But the radicalization theory makes those people the more serious targets. And unfortunately, it has a rebounding effect as well, where the suppression of those ideas and the efforts to harass and suppress so-called radicals creates a backlash, where if I believe that, hey, if I try this legal route, I'm going to get harassed by the FBI and prevented from getting my word out, then I might as well be violent.
They'd say, hey, go ahead and go to that march. See what the police do to you.
And if you're going to get in trouble for trying to express yourself in March, you might as well come hang out with us, and we're going to do serious violence.
That's not to say that ideas aren't dangerous. Violent ideologies drove Dylan Roof, Faisal Muhammad, and others to do what they did. But even the U.S. government doesn't have unlimited resources. And when we focus on the loudest people, like protesters, propagandists, and others who've been quote-unquote radicalized, the most dangerous people can be missed. It's violent crime that Mike says should take precedent.
So it's very important to do that, to speak out when dangerous ideas are spread and hateful ideas are spread. But that's not a law enforcement function. Law enforcement has plenty to do focusing on the criminal activity. And by doing so, they will make the public safer and deter crime because the people will start to realize they're not going to get away with it.
But he also says, don't take his word for it. Just look at the numbers pre-9/11.
In the 1990s, there were far more murders occurring, but a higher rate was solved. The solve rate was in the 80% to 90%, where now the solve rate is just around 50%, just over 50%. So even though there are far fewer crimes, less of them are solved. We have rape kits sitting gathering dust on the shelves of crime labs without being tested. And this backlog has been decades in the making, and invariably when they dig into them, they start solving more crimes. So we've gotten away from a simple form of law enforcement in which they actually solve crimes that occur. You know, that's really the assumption, that police solve crimes, but more and more they don't. Half the violent crime in the United States does not get cleared. And clearing only means that police have identified a suspect, not that they have put a person in jail.
That wasn't his experience in the 90s. Back in that trial in the Pacific Northwest, things were working.
I was cross-examined by 6 different defense attorneys. Every bit of evidence was challenged. So, it really impressed me that our system was perfectly suited to counterterrorism if what we're trying to do is reduce violence. But unfortunately, that requirement of reasonable indication of criminal activity to justify an investigation was tossed away after 9/11 in favor of suspecting everyone, basically.
After the break, it's not just that the FBI isn't solving crimes, but also that it can't track the ones it does. Back in 2017, when James Comey was busy clarifying that Dylan Roof was not, in fact, a terrorist, 2 piglets named Lily and Lizzie went missing from Circle 4 Farm in Utah.
So we hear this constant clanging in this facility because these mother pigs are desperate to get out of their crates.
The pigs were taken by activists who had entered the Smithfield Foods-owned factory farm to document the abysmal conditions. And they were pretty open about the whole thing. They even filmed themselves.
And this little piglet in the corner, her face is covered in blood and she's down on the ground. She's not going to make it, so we're going to take her out.
Nevertheless, the FBI mounted a hunt for the pigs, believing that their abductors were guilty of a serious crime. This is because we do have a law in the United States that allows law enforcement to deem animal activists, specifically animal activists, terrorists. It's called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So the FBI believed that these folks were guilty of terrorism for stealing the pigs.
And actually not just stealing them, really literally rescuing them. They were there to photograph the bad conditions and saw these 2 piglets struggling and likely would not survive absent their taking them and rehabilitating them. And the FBI actually, executed a search warrant to take a piece of those piglets' ears to try to prove that they came from that farm. Just ridiculous.
And okay, that's a particularly egregious example. But it's this kind of overly broad and yet narrow use of terrorism labels that led Mike and his colleagues at the Brennan Center to start asking for receipts.
So we worked with Congress, and in 2019, the National Defense Authorization Act was passed that required the FBI to provide basic data about its domestic terrorism program. The FBI over and over again will say, in domestic terrorism, we only investigate violence, we don't investigate ideology, but their categories are divided by ideology.
And the thing is that if you have a category for a particular ideology, like, say, animal or environmental terrorism, that requires you to have investigations in that category, even if there aren't actually any homicides to investigate. Mike and his team thought if they could see both sides of the ledger, they'd be able to better understand how the FBI was using its resources.
So if you know the number of domestic terrorism incidents by each category, the number of fatalities resulting from those incidents, so you can measure whether you're comparing apples to oranges, right? Somebody spray painting an SUV versus somebody committing a racist mass murder. Those are 2 different things, right? And then on the other side of the ledger, the number of investigations the FBI opened in each category, the number of indictments to see whether, okay, are your investigations actually proving anything, or are you just chasing hippies and harassing them?
So Congress passed a requirement for that reporting.
And the first year, the FBI just ignored it. The second year, they produced a report that shocked me because they admitted we don't collect domestic terrorism incident data, and we don't know how many fatalities there are caused by domestic terrorism in the United States. This is their number 1 priority, right? Counterterrorism, that they demanded all these new powers to be in a prevention mode, and they don't even count the number of attacks and the number of people who are killed by them.
So then Mike and his colleagues thought, hey, maybe we can do part of this ourselves. They filed a Freedom of Information Act request, went to court, and got shot down. The Justice Department argued that, first, releasing the numbers would be an invasion of privacy for the folks that they've publicly convicted. but also that essentially their numbers were not actually an accurate reflection of whether or not a case involved domestic terrorism.
So the FBI and Justice Department say they can't produce accurate data about the indictments and convictions they obtain in their domestic terrorism program.
Okay, but what's really going on here?
So I think what's really going on is the FBI wants to use its domestic terrorism authorities to suppress political movements it doesn't agree with. And, the FBI has long been a very conservative organization. So somebody who is preaching communism, that's threatening to them because they see communism as something that's very, very bad. And somebody who's committing racist murders, that's a police thing. That's not a national security threat because it's not meant to disrupt the social order. And what's very frustrating to me is often it's the same agents, and how I don't understand how in their minds they can say, all right, we're going to investigate this environmental rights group, not because they've done anything wrong, but, they say scary things and they might do something in the future, and we're in the prevention mode, so we have to devote resources to that. Where if Congress says, hey, can you count the number of people white supremacists kill? They say, nah, that's really a state and local police issue.
One of the reasons for this is a very Washington one.
The companies that engage in animal rights abuse, whether it's part of industry or whatever, have pockets full of money. And they talk to their congressman, and the congressman talks to the local FBI head. And what we see in some cases is FBI leaders are going to retire, and they want to get jobs at these big industry companies. So it makes sense, makes everybody happy to work on their behalf rather than on behalf of the American public.
But there's also another more boring and sort of nonsensical reason, which is that the FBI can't report out what it's doing about domestic terrorism because there are so many ways to classify any one crime.
If a white supremacist kills somebody, the FBI could consider that an act of domestic terrorism, and then that's their number one priority, lots of resources, big investigations. Or they could say it's a hate crime. That drops way down. You're no longer looking for anything but evidence of the motive of the attack. You're not looking for a broad group of fellow terrorists. And in the federal system, their policy is to defer hate crimes to investigations to state and local. Very few state and local law enforcement agencies, only about 15% actually report hate crimes occurring within their jurisdiction. So they're basically deferring it into a black hole. But if you get somebody arrested and send them to federal prison and they kill somebody in a racist violent attack, that's a Department of Corrections issue. That's not terrorism. That's not a hate crime. And if they somehow get out of prison and start murdering again, they're no longer domestic terrorists or civil rights violators. They're gang members.
The white supremacist doesn't change what he's doing. The government just has all of these different boxes that it can check.
And I think part of that is to dilute the knowledge of how prevalent a problem this is and how seriously it affects American communities. Because if they ever actually counted the incidents and counted all the deaths from all these various types of white supremacist violence, it'd be so much more significant than any other domestic terrorism category that it really couldn't justify targeting animal rights activists or environmentalists or so-called Black identity extremists.
A little postscript here. I just spoke to Mike in late January, but since that time, a lot has changed.
The FBI that I have covered my entire reporting career, the FBI that has existed since the day that J. Edgar Hoover died in May 1972, it is already over.
An unnamed FBI special agent is defending his colleagues who investigated the insurrection as Donald Trump prepares to boot the men and women who did their duty from their jobs.
He is asking to be head of the FBI, and he said that their headquarters should be shut down.
And what concerns me as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee is the attack, the purge, of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI.
We gave Mike a quick call back to ask how different these changes are from the history of abuse that we already discussed. He said first, Trump has been open about his intent to target his enemies.
So that there's an open threat, I think, creates a more hostile environment, particularly because the second way the Trump administration's approach to the FBI actually targets the FBI and targets the Justice Department. Agents don't get to decide what cases they work on. They're assigned cases. So by having a Justice Department official seek the names of anybody who worked on Trump-related cases or January 6th cases, what it's doing is sending a message that punishment will be arbitrary just as the assignments are arbitrary, that you'll have no control over what you can do, and that's paralyzing.
Mike and other experts have argued that's by design. When you look at how authoritarians gain power, they want people to be afraid, because afraid to step out of line means more willing to comply with the president. But he also pointed out that this definitely isn't the first time that the FBI's role has been politicized. And it's not even the first time it's been politicized in this way.
You might remember that the George W. Bush administration had a scandal where they fired a number of Justice Department U.S. attorneys and wanted to replace them with the term they were using was loyal Bushies. And that kind of intentional politicization becomes problematic because it's hard to depoliticize it without appearing to be repoliticizing it. So it's troubling and certainly something to watch out for going forward, even past this administration.
Whether 2025 or 1925, the Justice Department's problems have never been easy to fix. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like they will be fixed anytime soon. On the next episode of Things That Go Boom, we go to war. Sort of.
And I'm standing there, and all of a sudden this voice says, "Hey, Reb." And I look up, and this Yankees, quote unquote, is pointing his rifle at me and pulls the trigger. If I'd have been on a Civil War battlefield, I would have been shot. I would have probably have been killed in that battle right there.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. Mike's new book with co-author Beth Zasloff is called Policing White Supremacy: The Enemy Within. Definitely go check it out. This episode was produced by me with help from Nikki Galtland. Our music is composed by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes our show sound its very best. Thanks, as always, to the Carnegie Corporation of New York and all of the supporters that make this work possible. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks for our next episode.
And the prosecutor brought me in at the beginning of the undercover operation and said, okay, look, we have to make some ground rules. You're going to be recording every conversation. And the first thing to keep in mind is you can never use a racial epithet. It's like, oh, right. How am I going to pretend to be a white supremacist who doesn't use racial epithets? That's going to be interesting.